you have written two biographies, one on Milton Friedman and one on Ayn Rand. So if we can, we will focus on each one separately. But first, let's talk about the ideas that two of them held in common: the value of individual freedom, skepticism of collectivism, and the ethics of capitalism. Can you talk about the big picture ideas they converge on?
Yeah, so Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand, in the biggest picture, they're both individualists and they're skeptical of collectivities and collectivism. So their unit of analysis is the individual, what's good for the individual, what works for the individual, and their understanding of society kind of flows from that. They also both use this focus on individualism to justify and to support capitalism as a social and economic system. So we can put them in a similar category. We can call them individualists. We could call them libertarians of a sort. But they're also really different in how they approach capitalism, how they approach thinking. Ayn Rand developed her own moral and philosophical system to justify individualism and to connect the individual to capitalism and to support capitalism as a social and economic system. Friedman struggles a bit more with how to justify capitalism, and he'll ultimately come down to freedom as his core value, like his God, as he says. And so freedom does connect back to the individual, but he's not justifying capitalism for his own sake. He's justifying it for its ability to underwrite freedom in a social sense and also in the individual sense.
At a high level, are there interesting differences between them? You already mentioned a few, maybe in terms of who they are personally, maybe in terms of how they approach the justification for capitalism, maybe other ways.
Yeah, for sure. So beyond this idea that Milton Friedman takes a while to come to his justification of capitalism, whereas Ayn Rand kind of has it from the start. She really focuses on the core quality of rationalism and rationality. And rationality is the defining feature of human beings. And so she works from there, whereas Milton Friedman eventually converges on this idea of freedom. So that's one part of it. The other is their intellectual styles are really, really different. Their interpersonal styles are really different. So Friedman has big ideas, big principles that guide him, but he's also deeply empirical. He spends most of his career doing historical research, economic research, pulling data from how people actually make economic decisions and live in the world and using them to test and refine his theories. Where Rand, to some degree, we could say she's empirical in that she lives through the Russian Revolution and takes a very big lesson from that. But her style of thinking is really first principles, an axiomatic approach, going from the basic idea of rationality and then playing that out in different spheres. And so those are just very different intellectual approaches. And then they lead in some ways to really different ways of thinking about how you get things done in the world. Ayn Rand is a purist. She wants to start with the pure belief. She doesn't want it to be diluted. One of her favorite sayings was, it's earlier than you think. In other words, we're still moving towards a place where we can really hold and express these ideals purely. Friedman, although he didn't use this terminology, was much more a half a loaf guy. Like, I'll take what I can get and then I'll try to move to where I really want to be. But he is able to compromise, especially when he moves from being an economist into being more of a political thinker. And so that's a really different intellectual style. And then it also plays out in their lives in that Ayn Rand is incredibly schismatic. I mean, she wants her friends to believe what she believes and support what she supports. And she's willing to break a relationship if it doesn't match. Milton Friedman, he also does tend to have friends who agree with him, yet he's always willing to debate his opponents, and he's willing to do so with a smile on his face. He's the happy warrior, and he actually will win a lot of debates simply by his emotional affect and his cheerfulness and his confidence, where Rand will lose debates because she gets so angry in the face of disagreement. So yeah, they have a lot of similarities and a lot of differences, and it's been really fascinating to kind of dive deep into both of them.
I just re-listened to Ayn Rand's, I think, last lecture, or at least it's called that, and just the confrontational nature of how she answers questions or how she addresses critics and so on. There is a kind of charisma to that. So I think both of them are very effective at winning over sort of popular support, but in very different styles. It seems like Ayn Rand is very cranky, but it's the most charismatic, cranky person I think I've ever listened to.
Yeah, I mean, people talked about her, meeting her, and coming to believe in her ideas in a similar way as they did with Marxism, in that suddenly everything made sense. And that when they came to believe in objectivism, they felt they had this engine for understanding the entire world. Now, after a while, for most people, that then became confining. But yeah, that certainty. And Friedman had some of that as well. He clothed it differently. He clothed it in happiness, where Rand kind of clothed it, as you said, in crankiness or anger. I mean, there's also an arc to Rand. She gets kind of angrier and angrier and crankier over the course of her life.
Yeah.
What I enjoyed about my research is I was able to get into this early moment when she was different and a little more open. And then I kind of watched her close and her harden over time.
Would it be fair to say that Milton Friedman had a bit more intellectual humility, where he would be able to sort of evolve over time and be convinced by the reality of the world to change sort of the nuances of policies, the nuances of how he thought about economics or about the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Friedman believed in being able to say I was wrong.
Right.
And there are some things he said he was wrong about. We'll delve more into monetarism and monetary policy, but he was able to talk about the ways his ideas hadn't mapped onto the world the way he thought they would. He does a really interesting interview at the end of his life where he's beginning to voice some doubts about globalization, which was, he was sort of a prophet of globalization, a cheerleader of globalization. He really thought it would lead to a better world in all respects. And towards the end of his life, it's about 2 years before he dies, there's a note of doubt about how globalization unfolded and what it would mean, particularly for the American worker. And so you can see him still thinking. And that, to me, I had sort of assumed he became crankier and more set in his ways. And of course, there's a phase where he does become that way, especially as he's in the public eye and there's not room for nuance. But to find in the last years of his life, him being so reflective, that was absolutely not something Rand could do.
I think there's a thread throughout this conversation where we should actually also say that you're kind of a historian of ideas.
I am a historian of ideas, yes.
And so we're talking about today, in part, about two people who kind of fought for ideas, for an idea, like we mentioned, freedom for capitalism, and they did it in very different ways. And it's so interesting to see sort of the impact they both had and how their elucidation, explanation of those ideas like reverberated throughout society, and how we together as a society figure out what works, the degree to which they have influence on the public, the degree to which they have influence on individual administrations like the Reagan administration, Nixon, and so on, and how it might return, like fade away and then come back in the modern times.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting if you just see this whole world as a game of ideas where we were like pushing and pulling and trying to figure stuff out. A bunch of people got real excited over 100 years ago about communism, and then they tried stuff out, and then the implementation broke down, and we keep playing with ideas. So these are the two greats of playing with ideas. So I think that's a thread that just runs through this.
Yeah, and of kind of pushing back against that movement towards communism, social democracy. But one difference that I really should emphasize, Rand is a writer of fiction. She's a philosopher, but she's also a writer of fiction. So she is working almost in the mythic register, much more in the psychological register. She's creating characters that people identify with and people relate to experiences they've had. And that's one of the reasons she hits so deep. And she's also offering people, I read all the fan letters to her. People would say things like, I read The Fountainhead and now I'm getting a divorce. Having just these incredible realizations.
Milton Friedman didn't get such things.
Milton Friedman didn't get such things. Or, I'll meet someone and they'll say to me, Ayn Rand is the reason I went to medical school. Like a woman said this to me a few years back. It never even occurred to me that I could be a doctor until I read Ayn Rand. And I said, I'm going to go to medical school. And so she has that really intense impact on people. So she thought of herself as rational. She thought of rationality as kind of what she was doing, but she was actually doing a kind of mythopoetic psychological work as well. Whereas Friedman, on the one hand, was much more rational. And there's a whole set of economic thinking, and he provides a rational framework for understanding the world. And it's the framework of, neoclassical economics. At the same time, he does pull on mythologies, of the idea of America in the Gilded Age, the frontier mythology, the individual immigrant, the settler mythology. He pulls on these, but he doesn't create them. He's more kind of playing a tune he already has. Whereas I think Rand really does something a little bit deeper in her ability to reach into people's psyche and then take that emotional, psychological experience and fuse it to an intellectual world and a political world. And that's really what makes her so powerful. And so I think she comes back in to relevancy in a different way than Friedman does, because I think in some ways she's tapped into a kind of more universal human longing for independence and autonomy and kind of self-creation and self-discovery.